So usually what they do before the Torah portion, they do the blessing. We don't have one printed out yet, but somebody sent us a picture, so this is what we're going to use for now. So it's just a blessing to bless us and the Torah and to hope that we learn from it. So it goes, Baruch atah Adonai Hamarah, Baruch Adonai Hamarah Le'olam Vayed, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, Asher b'chuvanu mikol ha'amim v'natzavanu Torah, Baruch atah Adonai Noten HaTorah. Bless Adonai who is blessed, blessed is Adonai who is blessed now and forever. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of the universe, who has chosen us from among the peoples and given us the Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, who gives the Torah.
Amen.
So before we move on to this portion, does anybody remember what happened last week? It's very important.
You mean it? That it ended?
Not everything, but like, what was like the biggest thing that happened to Jacob? People that were here last week. If you weren't here last week, that's fine. Anybody? Or if you were not.
I mean, a lot happened to Jacob.
Yeah, a lot happened.
Well, what was something that's central to this portion? And he saw something.
Oh, the ladder?
Oh.
He saw the angels go up and down right
Yes.
towards heaven.
Yes.
And then what happened afterwards? Did God speak with him, right?
Yes.
God spoke with him, right? So we're gonna read that back, and that's gonna tie in with today's.
He sat on the pillar and
So if somebody could read.
I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, and to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until what I have done with what I have promised you. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, How awesome is this place! There is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven.
So you see that God promised him offspring. He promised that he would protect him and be with him as long as that Jacob stood by his side. Right? That was the terms of his condition. And then afterwards, if somebody could read that.
Yeah. So early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on the top of it. He called the name of the place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at first. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, If God will be with me and will be with me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I may come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give you a tenth. I will give you a full tenth to you.
This is important because Jacob, he makes a vow, and vows back then were a very big deal. It's not like today where if I ask you something and you're like, yeah, sure, I'll do it, and then you don't do it, it's not really much of a big deal today if somebody breaks a promise. But back then, it meant a lot because it meant your honor. Yes, a lot of times when they did a vow, they would use the God's name, so the honor of the God was also reflected if you didn't keep the vow. So when he does his vow, he's putting a lot on the line. It's not just like, oh yeah, like a little promise. It's a big thing. And then on top of that, it says at the very end that he would give him a tenth of everything that God gave him. So he promised to give an offering back to God. And that's going to be important for this portion. So just to recap, we see that God gave Jacob an offer. He said, if you follow me, I'll give you land, I'll give you offspring, and I'll give you protection. And then Jacob accepts the offer, and he makes a vow, and he says if he gives him food, if he clothes him, if he protects him, he will be his God. God will be his master. And that's like a language of patron-client relationship. So a patron-client relationship is when you have the patron, which is the guy over you, and he would give you protection, he would give you clothing, he would give you food, and in return the client will serve the patron. So there's like this relationship that's happening between Jacob and God where God gives him stuff, and then in return Jacob shows his loyalty. But he promised that he would return to Bethel, and that he'd give God a tenth of his offerings. So this type of covenant is called a bilateral covenant. A bilateral covenant is where both parties are obliged to the promise to the other. So if me and Lucas make a covenant, he agrees to fulfill his part of the promise for me, and I agree to fulfill my promise for him. If one of us breaks that agreement, then whatever is in the terms of the covenant will fall on that person. So it's kind of like like buying a car. How many of you guys have bought a car or gone to a dealership? 2 people. Okay. But so when you guys eventually one day when you get a car and you go to the dealership, you negotiate the price, and then when you get on the price, you sign this contract on paper saying, I'll pay this price, and after I pay it, you give me the title of the car, and now I own the car. And that's an example of a bilateral covenant. I do my end, you do your end. If you don't meet your end, well now I can sue you. If you don't give me the title, or if I don't pay the car, they can take away the car. It's like that. And then the Torah is an example of a bilateral covenant. God asks us to keep His commandments, and in return He will provide for us. We agree to keep His commandments, and we'll give Him our loyalty. If we break that, and then what falls upon us is the curses that come with the law. And God, since He's God, He's never going to break His promise. It's all on us if we're going to keep it or not. So we decide, are we going to follow God, or are we going to go astray? And if we go astray, that means those things that He promised us it's not going to be guaranteed anymore. And Rico was talking about how the Torah is set up in a casuistic and apodictic, a legal formula. And I know those are really big words, so I'm going to explain it. So casuistic is when the law is a case-by-case law. It follows an if and then clause. And it's very prevalent in the ancient Near East. And it's very similar to today's laws. For example, before I go to the Bible example, like today, if you cross a red light, that means you get a ticket. So that's an example of a if and then clause. And we see it in the Bible. It says, if a people quarrel and one person hits another with a stone or with their fists, and the victim does not die but is confined to bed, the one who struck the blow will not be held liable. The other can get up and walk around outside with a staff. However, the guilty party must pay the injured person for any loss of time and see that the victim is completely healed. It sounds a lot like our laws that we have today. If this happens, then we got to do this. And that's what casuistic means. It's a case by case. But then what makes the Torah interesting is that it's also apodictic. And apodictic is interesting because before they thought it was very unique to Israel, and then they found out that the Hittites, and I think, I forgot what was the other nation, they also had apodictic laws. But Israel, what made them special is that it was more prevalent in their laws than in the other nations. So it was very rare in the other nations. And what makes apodictic different is that it's a direct command. It's generally applicable, and it doesn't come with direct conditions or stipulations. So it's just a general command for something new to do. Can you guys think of an example of that in the Bible? Like a general command for what you should and shouldn't do? There's 10 of them.
The commandments.
Well, there's more than 10 of them, but the 10 basic ones that we know.
The commandments.
10 commandments, right?
Like which ones?
Well, you don't have to tell me which ones, but they're in that style.
Keep
They,
the Sabbath.
but yeah, keep this. Thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not covet your neighbor's stuff. They're general commands. They don't really have a stipulation that comes with it. It doesn't say if you covet your neighbor's stuff, then so and so happens.
Yeah.
It's just a direct command for something for you to do. So, example, thou shalt not murder. But it doesn't say if you murder, such and such will happen. It does say later on, I believe in Exodus or Leviticus or Deuteronomy, if I'm not mistaken. But it just says it's a very generic command that says thou shalt not murder. And it's setting the behavior that God expects from you. I was reading from this article on a page, and it was saying that a lot of people, they have this misunderstanding of apodictic laws because they say that it's too general, that you can misinterpret it, and you can interpret it any way you want. But they give a good example because in the Torah it talks about how you shouldn't put a stumbling block in a blind person's way or harm a person that is deaf. That's me paraphrasing that verse. But that doesn't mean that you can mess with anybody else who's, handicapped or any other disability. What it's trying to tell you is that when there's somebody disabled, you have to treat them with kindness. And if you don't do that, that's bad. So that's what apodictic laws, that's what they're meant for. They teach you how to behave. That's the purpose of them. They're not like our laws today where we have, like I said, traffic laws. Traffic laws, they don't teach you morally how to be a good citizen. It's just for you not to hit somebody else and get in a bad accident. it's good that we don't get in an accident, but it's not teaching you how to be a good person. And that's the difference between altruistic and apodictic laws. Apodictic laws, they teach you how God expects you to behave. And after the laws were given, apodictic laws, what they would do, they would give an oath, and then they would have to give a pledge. And that was the formula for apodictic laws. And we see that in the Ten Commandments. God gives them those 10 Commandments and the rest of the commandments, and then they agree to the terms, and then they give them their word, and then there's a pledge. And now they're binded by it. There's a contract. And then we see oaths in the Bible. They were very important in the ancient Near East. Covenants were ratified with an oath using the name of deities. So you would say, I promise as my witness, blah, blah, whatever name you can think of, as a witness to me keeping this oath. And if I break it, whatever curses that God puts on me, it will fall upon me.
You see that a lot also in the last portion, whenever Jacob and Laban come into covenant, right? They both use the deities and stuff.
Yeah, so the deities are usually used with a covenant. And it's funny though, because like Rico pointed out, what makes the Torah special is that usually like other covenants, it would be between like a person and another person. And then the deities would be like witnesses. So it was more poetic. They were like, let's for example, Baal and this other god, he's a witness to this covenant between me and Lucas, and that's it. But with the Torah, you have God makes a direct covenant with the people. There's no other law in ancient Near East that does that. So that's what makes it unique. God wants to come down and make a covenant with you directly. He's not doing it through some middleman. He comes down on the mountain. So it's a big deal for that time. For us, it's just like, oh, that's really cool. But nobody else had that back then. So that's what made them special and set apart. So breaking the oath meant shaming the deities and bringing it upon the persons. And that's what happens when we break the Torah. When we break the Torah, we shame God, and then we bring upon curses. And it's not that God is giving you these curses. It's that you choose to do the wrong thing, and then you step out of like this bubble. Because God's protection is kind of like a fence. And when you're inside of it, you're fine. And then when you step out of that fence, now you don't have that protection. Now you're out there by yourself, fending out for yourself. And then when you get hurt or something bad happens to you, it's not a surprise. You went astray, and now that happened. And this is actually what it means when it says not to take the Lord's name in vain. A lot of like when I grew up in the Christian church, like you would say like you can't use the God's name in a curse or something like that, like damn or something like that. But that's not what it means. What it means is like if you, for example, let's say you give me your word, right? And you say I swear, you give me your word that you'll do something, and you swear on God's name that you'll do it, and then you break it. That's a big deal. In the Bible, that's a big deal because now you didn't have to use God's name, but because you did, now you have to complete it. Because if you don't complete it, now you're shaming God's name, and that brings shame to Him. He gets really upset when that happens. And there's examples of that in the Bible. So it's very important that you keep your word. It's a very big deal. And it's also important to watch what word you keep. You can't just go around keeping any oath. And we'll see in the Bible, there's examples where sometimes they make a mistake and they made an oath that they shouldn't have. So you have to be careful which oaths you make, and you got to be careful that you keep those oaths. Otherwise, you bring upon shame. And here's an example of that. In Joshua 9, we have the Gibeonites. I don't know if you guys have read that. But the Gibeonites, the Canaanites, they were all getting together, all the nations together were getting together, and they were coming out to fight Israel. And then the Gibeonites, they were smart. They put on old clothes, they put on old wineskins, they came on a donkey, and they lied to the Israelites. They told them, well, we're from this faraway place. Why don't we do this covenant between us? And, you'll protect us, and we'll watch each other's backs. So Joshua, thinking that they were from a faraway place, he was supposed to talk to God first. He didn't, and he went and he did an oath with them. He did an oath with God's name, using God's name, that he would protect them. And then they found out after the fact that they were Gibeonites. The Gibeonites were supposed to die. They were not good people. All the Canaanites, they were involved with, murdering people, child sacrifices, all these nasty stuff that I'm not going to talk about. But they were sick people. But because they used God's name, now they can't go back on that. Even though those people were bad and they deserve it, because they put God's name, they have to protect and they have to keep their word. So Israel could not attack them. So if the Gibeonites ended up becoming their servants, they would draw the water and they would bring the wood for the altar that they built. But then we see later on in 2 Samuel 21, there's a famine in the land for 3 years during David's reign. And he's curious, like, why is this going on? Like, what's going on? What did I do wrong? So he goes and he inquires of the Lord. He asks him, like, hey, like, did I do something wrong? Is it me? Is it you? I don't think it's you, but he tells him that because Saul slaughtered all the Gibeonites, he broke the oath that he made with Joshua. Even though, like I said, the Gibeonites, they deserved to die. They were supposed to die. But because of that oath, now they can't be touched because now that involved God's name. But then, because Saul did that, he shamed God. And because of that, God had to bring this restitution. Because now there was an injustice. They went back on their word, and that shows that puts God in a bad light. So then God had to restore order and give justice to the Gibeonites. So he put a famine in the land until all the sons of Saul died. And that's why it's important that you watch out which oath you do. You don't use God's name involved in the oath, and you make sure that you keep it. Oaths were very important. That's why Jacob's oath was very important. It wasn't just like a pinky promise or something like that. It was a big deal. You put everything on the line. So I know I talked about a lot of different terms, and sometimes it seems kind of unnecessary. I had to do a calculus test today. It really sucked. But in math, you see something called like definitions, and definitions are really hard to read and understand. They're like, you might as well write it in Chinese because I don't understand it. And then you have the theorems, and the theorems they're my friend, okay? The theorems, they show you the formula, they put the definitions in English. So they tells you, if you see this pattern, you do this formula, and that's it. And then you have the proofs, and I always thought the proofs were dumb because it proves the theorem. Like, I already believe you. I don't have to, you don't have to prove that the theorem's right, I believe you. But the point of the proof is so that you understand and you see the pattern. So when you do the math and you see this random equation, you're like, I recognize that pattern. I understand how the theorem works. Now I can do it by myself, and then you get it like that. And this is what we're doing. I'm showing you these terms. Me and Lucas, when we show you these terms that are really crazy, you recognize these patterns. And then when you read it, you're like, oh, I know what's going on. Like, how many times have we seen in the Bible so far them raising a pillar? Right? Many times. And now we know that means that that's a covenant. And on top of that, when you start building that knowledge, somebody's going to come one day and they're going to say something really weird to you. And usually what's funny about those people, they say something like, well, I feel, that's my opinion. I feel like this, and I feel like, like I can't think of an example off the top of my head. Like I've had many discussions with many people, but usually like it's the same thing. They have an opinion and it's not based upon any facts. But then when you come with the facts like this and you say, well, I think, for example, we're going to talk about in this portion that Jacob, that he submitted himself to Esau based on the language in the Bible. And you can tell them this, this, and this based upon this. And what are they going to tell you? They're just going to tell you, well, I don't think so. And there you want the discussion. But what they're saying is basically, I don't agree because I don't want to agree. You know what I mean? That's why it's good to have that.
Is that recorded?
No, it's okay, but it's like start freezing.
So freezing?
Yeah, don't touch it.
Oh, don't
Yeah, don't touch the wax.
Okay, sorry.
No, that's fine. So we're going to recap. So God and Jacob had a bilateral covenant, meaning they had promises to each other that they had to oblige to. God provides for Jacob, in return Jacob serves him. And then Jacob promised that he would return to Bethel and give him a tenth of his blessings. And then the Torah is written in casuistic and apodictic formula. Casuistic, remember, means if and then. Apodictic were direct laws like thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal. Apodictic laws were followed by an oath by the people. And then oaths were crucial in the ancient Near East because if you broke your word, then God's name would be shamed. Your word meant everything, and it was associated with God. So you couldn't just randomly give out an oath. And if you were giving out an oath, it's because it was something special. It meant something. So later on, we see that Jacob encounters the angel. If somebody can read, and if not, I will keep. We're on camera, so you're on the spot.
I don't think anybody wants to read.
Nobody wants to read? I'm gonna pick you.
Read?
What a mark.
And Jacob was left alone, and the man wrestled with them until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip sockets.
Yeah.
But and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with them. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day has broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What's your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered."
So Jacob has like this crazy encounter with this messenger from God. He wrestles Jacob, and they wrestle what looks like all night until he pops his socket. I don't know how that has to look like or feel like, but I imagine it hurt. So he has this encounter, and he gets blessed. He gets his name changed, and then right afterwards, he sees that Esau is coming. And that whole scenario that happened just kind of goes out the window, you know. Instead of having that faith and that courage, he just shatters up like he crumbles like a piece of paper. Somebody else could read it. But you.
Sure. And Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau his brother in the land of Seir, the country of Edom, instructing them, "Thus you shall say to my lord Esau," well, that's not good. "Thus says your servant Jacob," that's not good. "I have sojourned with Laban and stayed until now. I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, male servants, and female servants. I have sent to tell my lord," that's not good, "in order that I may find favor in your sight." So he stayed there that night, and from what he had with him he took a present for his brother Esau, 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 milking camels and their calves, 40 cows and 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys.
So we see, like I said, Jacob and God, they established this patron-client relationship. God is Jacob's master. And then he goes because he gets scared that Esau's going to kill him. He sends his servant out, and he's like, "Well, say that your servant Jacob, you know, he's sending you something. He's sending you a gift. And that if he could find favor in your sight, since you are his master, you know." He's trying to butter him up, but he's not supposed to be doing it. Because back then, if you said that, your word meant a lot back then. It's not like today where you could just say something, and then when you turn around and be like, "I didn't really like that guy." Something like that. You can't do that back then. It meant everything. So him doing this is basically that legal language making him his master over you. Even though he's not supposed to, because one, he didn't get the blessing or the birthright. So why is he calling him his brother, his master? You know? And then on top of that, he gives him a present that he was supposed to give to God, an offering. And he gives him a very expensive offering. I'm not sure the monetary value of what it would be today, but let's say he gave him like $200,000, basically, you know. He gave him a bunch of goats, ewes, that's a female sheep, you know, rams, milking camels, all this stuff. And he gave it to him because he was afraid of him. He got scared and he let that take control of him. So then we see that Jacob is submitting himself to Esau. He's calling himself a servant and Esau his master. Jacob gives a portion to Esau instead of God like he promised. And when Jacob approaches Esau, he says that he bows down 7 times. And that's a very big deal, because that meant something in the portion, in the ancient Near East. I'm sorry. So I'm going to read these letters that they found in the ancient Near East about these people bowing down 7 times, and you see that it means something. So it says, "Say to the king, Pharaoh, my lord and my son, message of I don't know how to pronounce the name. I think it's Beridia. I hope so.
Yeah.
The ruler of Majida. I think that's the loyal servant of the king. I prostrate myself at the feet of my king, my lord, and my son 7 times and 7 times. And then again, it says here, "Say to the king, my lord, my son, message of Berida, your loyal servant. I fall at the feet of my king, my lord, and my son 7 times and 7 times." So it was a way of saying, like, I submit to you. I bowed down to you 7 times, and then sometimes it would also come with a pledge, an offering that they would have to give. So we see this bowing down 7 times was symbolic, and like I said, it meant that you were submitting yourself to a person. I mean, imagine nowadays, like today,
Yeah.
if you went and you bowed down 7 times, like people would look at you kind of weird, like, why are you doing it? You would look pathetic, right? So that's what you're doing. You're humbling yourself for the master. And that's what Jacob's doing. He's submitting himself, making Esau his master. And he's not supposed to do that. You know, God said, if I'm with you, I'm with you. You don't have to worry about anything. I'm going to give you the clothes and the food that you want. I'm going to protect you. I'm going to give you the land. He said that your offspring is going to be like the dust of the earth. I don't know if you guys ever try to count dust. I mean, sand you can, but dust, I mean, this is kind of impossible. But then this weird thing happens. You know, when after he bows down to Esau, and they get together, Esau goes and embraces Jacob, and he gives him a kiss. So it says, but Esau ran to him, embraced him, and fell on his neck, and kissed him, and they wept. Which is kind of weird because Esau was like this macho man in the woods type of thing, hunter. But it's interesting because in the Hebrew, they have these 6 dots above the word, and it actually means something. It means that it wasn't a regular kiss. And there's like 2 interpretations. One interpretation I saw was he kissed him, but it was out of character because, you know, he was cruel in his heart, and he wasn't that type of sensitive person. He was kind of cold. But another interpretation is that when he kissed him on the neck, what he really wanted to do was rip his throat out, like violent, because he hated him. And we can see that because if we look at his descendants, the Edomites, they hated the Israelites. They wanted nothing to do with them, and they have this ongoing rivalry.
Yeah, rivalry.
They had this thing going on between them for like many years because Esau had this hatred for Jacob. So because I've seen some Christian interpretation where it's like, see, this is a story about love and reconciliation, you know, how people can overcome and stuff like that. But that's not really what's going on.
So do those 6 dots, the dots on top, does that mean it's not a character? Is that what that means in Hebrew?
I think what the dots are supposed to represent, from what I remember, what I read, is that it. Can you say something?
Yeah. In one of the interpretations where they think they bit him, they say that because the dots represent his teeth. Like
Yeah,
he's
that's-
gonna bite him.
Really?
So that's why, yeah, that's one of the interpretations that the dots represent the teeth.
Interesting.
But,
That's why they think.
If I remember, sometimes in Hebrew, like when those like dots show up on the word, it's trying to point something out to you,
Yeah.
and that's where that comes from, and that's where those 2 interpretations. I think it might have been the one where he wanted to bite it because he stole everything, you know,
Yeah.
the birthright, the blessing. He became great, but he held that thing on his brother for years. So it says the 6 dots above the word indicated it wasn't a ordinary kiss, like I said. And like I said, some interpretations read it that Jacob wanted to kill Jacob. Esau wanted to kill Jacob. So Jacob, he goes astray. Where was he supposed to go? So after receiving his blessing, what did Jacob promise God? And like you said, he was supposed to go to Bethel. Because he said, this is the gate of the heavens, this is the house of God.
Yeah.
I'm going to come back here, I'm going to give my offering, you know, all that stuff. And instead he goes somewhere completely different. Somebody wants to read. Verse 21. Chris?
Yeah. But Jacob journeyed to Succoth and built himself a house and made booths for his livestock. Therefore, the name of the place is called Succoth. Verse 7. And Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan. On his way from Padan Aram, he camped before the city. And from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he bought for 100 pieces of money the piece of land on which he had pitched his tent. There he erected an altar and called it Elohe Israel.
So you see, like, he said he was going to come back to Bethel. He didn't. He broke his oath. First, he gives his brother the tent. Then he calls him his master because he's scared. And then he doesn't return to where he's supposed to go, and he goes off astray, and he buys a plot of land and lives in the city, off the city of Shechem. And it's funny because after this happens, and he starts seeing all this chaotic stuff starts happening in his life because he chose not to obey God. And it doesn't mean that if you guys don't obey God directly, bad things start happening. But it's more like, I don't know, if you guys live in your parents' house and you just decide I'm gonna go live on my own, and you just leave the house without any money, like how long do you think you're gonna live? What do you think is gonna happen to you? Like eventually you're gonna be in a box on the road. You know what I mean? So when you leave the parents or the father's protection, now you know things are not guaranteed like they used to be. So then we see Jacob's daughter ends up getting raped. And if somebody wants to read this one, somebody.
Marcus.
You want to read it?
Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had born to Jacob, went out to see the women of the land. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, he seized her and lay with her and humiliated her. And his soul was drawn to Dinah, and the daughter of Jacob. He loved the young woman and spoke tenderly to her. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, "Give me this girl for my wife."
Do we see something interesting? It says that she went out to see the women of the land. Like normally that was not a normal thing for women to do. They always went out with the family or the men of the house because back then the world was kind of dangerous. It was dangerous. So if you just went out by yourself, like there's no guarantee you're gonna come back. It's not like today where it's like, oh, I'm gonna go downtown and I don't know, go to Starbucks or whatever and get some food and then come back. No, it's like you had to stay in the house for protection because if you go out by yourself, anything can happen to you. It's like if I go to a bad neighborhood and I staple $100 bills to my jacket and then I get mugged. I mean, I'm not saying that Dina deserved to get raped. That's not what I'm saying. But if you go into areas where you're not supposed to, you know, things can happen, and that's why you have to be careful. There's also something interesting. You know, I was talking with Lucas before this. I didn't have it on the slides because I didn't get like guaranteed information. But it's interesting to know that in some different cultures that rape had different meanings for different cultures. Like I was telling you that in Rome, they would consider rape if a Christian person married a Roman person because for them a Christian person was a porn, an abomination. So for them that was considered rape. So I don't know if in this case, like for the Israel, like marriage outside of what would you call it, wedlock would be considered rape because you know it wasn't done correctly.
Right.
I don't know if that's the case. I can't say for 100% for sure. I would like to talk to Rico about that. But I think like knowing the father's character and how the Torah is set up, I don't think he would just let you be with somebody that is abusive. You know what I mean? But back then they used to do that in the Hittite culture. They would have, if the daughter was raped, she'd have to marry the rapist because it's kind of gross. But you have to think about it in the sense of, because nowadays when you do marriage, you do it because you know you and the other person, you love each other very much, and then you have the house and you have the kids and stuff like that. But back then it was more because you know you needed protection. Because a woman on her own, like usually if she doesn't have anybody to take care of her, she's going to end up becoming either a slave or a prostitute because it was really hard for a woman to take care of herself back then. So that's why they would look to get married because that was that guarantee of that protection. So back then marriage was more about stability, me having a stable home, food, and clothes. And that's why it's kind of hard to understand sometimes because we're looking at it through our lenses today. You know, here today things are kind of romanticized. You know, we kind of emotionized everything. But back then it was more because, you know, you wanted to make sure that you were taken care of. And that's why they would do that for the daughter. They would marry her to the rapist because back then if you were violated, nobody would want to marry you. Like, clear cut. It's not like today where like, you know, that wouldn't bother somebody. Back then it was a big deal. You were shamed, that was on your name, everybody knew about it. So there was no guarantee that she'd be married and she'd end up dying either having to prostitute herself or slavery and things like that. So that's why the family would want to marry her off to that, just for that guarantee that she would be saved. So that's what happens here. The sons of Jacob answered Shechem and his father more deceitfully because he had defiled his sister. And they said to them, well, I'm sorry, I think I skipped a bit. Well, so eventually Shechem and his father, they come to Jacob and they say, hey, why don't you give us your daughter for a wife for my son? And the sons of Jacob, they were not happy about that because obviously, you know, they defiled her sister and they were really upset about that. But like I said back then, they were really worried that if she didn't have a husband since she was violating, nobody would want to marry her, and then what's going to happen to her? Right? If Jacob doesn't live forever, she's eventually going to have to do what? Sell herself? Things like that? So that's why he gave her to Shechem. But the sons of Jacob, because usually when they would do that, they would have a bride price. So when you'd marry a person, or if that happened, if you violated if a person was violated, there would be a bride price that they would have to pay. So they said, we'll give you the bride price for this offense. And they said, well, instead of giving us money, what we want is for you to circumcise yourself. Because we don't want her to be with somebody that is uncircumcised. Let me just read it. The sons of Jacob answered Shechem and his father Hamor deceitfully because he had defiled their sister Dinah. They said to them, we cannot do this thing to give our sister to one who is uncircumcised, for that would be a disgrace to us. Only on this condition we will agree with you, that you will become as we are by every male among you being circumcised. Then we will give our daughters to you, and we will take your daughters to ourselves, and we will dwell with you and become one people. But if you will not listen to us and be circumcised, then we will take our daughter and we will be gone. So they did it thinking that, they're not going to do it, because it's kind of crazy. But he ends up doing it, Shechem. And then he goes and he talks to the rest of the men of the people, trying to encourage them to do that. Because I'm pretty sure that was a really hard conversation.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But then he says, these men are at peace with us. Let them dwell in the land and trade it. Trade in it, for behold, the land is large enough for them. Let us take their daughter as wives, and let us give them our daughters. Only on this condition will the men agree to dwell with us to become one people. When every male among us is circumcised as they are circumcised. Will not their livestock be, and their property and all their beasts be ours? So he's telling them, hey, if we circumcise ourselves, their riches are going to be ours, because we're going to become one people. But is that what the circumcision was meant for? No, circumcision is a step where you start off like Abraham. You start off with faith. You hear that calling from God and you follow him, and then little by little you start building that relationship, and then the circumcision is like the sign of that relationship. And you see that in Judaism when you have converts, they would have Gentiles who were not circumcised yet. They were in this process, and when they get to that final process, then they would get circumcised as a sign of that relationship that they have with God. So what they're doing here is wrong, because circumcision was meant to be this symbolic relationship between people and God. But now they're doing it because they want to be one people and have the riches. And it's wrong. And on top of that, because the circumcision is tied to God, it's kind of like what happened with Joshua and the Gibeonites. They made this oath with God's name, tying the people. So now there's this oath with the people, since they end up circumcising themselves. Now they're tied to God through His name. And then what happens next? That's why what happened was bad. So who wants to read that? So you.
On the third day when they were sore, two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and came against the city while it felt secure and killed all the males. They killed Hamor and his son Shechem with the sword and took Dinah out of Shechem's house and went away. The sons of Jacob came upon the slain and plundered the city because they had defiled their sister. They took their flocks and their herds, their donkeys, and whatever was in the city and in the field. All their wealth, all their little ones and their wives, all that was in the houses, they captured and plundered.
So, what happened here is kind of like I said, what happened with the Gibeonites and Saul. Saul killed the Gibeonites, even though they were supposed to die. They made this oath, and Saul was not allowed to break that oath since God's name was involved. So, when the people of Shechem, the city of Shechem, when they circumcised themselves, they created this covenant basically with God. So, by Simeon and Levi going and killing them, even though it was deserved because they defiled Dinah, now after the fact, now they're shaming God's name. And that's why later on we see that all of Jacob's sons, they have issues. All of Jacob's sons. Well, I don't think we can't even edit it out.
No.
Oh my gosh.
And he kept touching the box.
He looked like deep into it. He looked like, man, that guy looked to my soul. So what they did was not good. Even though it was justice for Dinah, because they did that covenant between the people and God, now it brought shame to God's name. And that shows you that how important oaths are. Just because maybe the person didn't deserved it, because you made that oath, now you have to stick to that oath. That's how important oaths were. You can't break it. But that shows us when we make our oath with God. When we go and we say that we'll keep the commandments, that we'll be His people, we'll follow the feasts and stuff like that. Even for Christianity, when they give their oath that they'll follow God, part of that oath is following the commandments. And so if they're not keeping their word, that brings stuff. So again, the importance of oaths. Circumcision is a physical symbol of submitting to God. So they're only for those who are serious about following God. The city of Shechem agreed to those terms. However, the act of circumcision is linked to God's name. So slaughtering the city brought shame to God's honor, just like Saul killed the Gibeonites. So let's recap what we read, just so we have it fresh in our brains. Actually, can somebody recap what we read? People in the corner with the cold hands?
Jesse, for sure.
Can you recap?
Oh, it said I can't see.
Oh, no. You don't have to read it.
I was like,
I want you to recap what we talked about. Reiterate what I said. Well, what did I talk about? At least one thing.
About the lady and the dude. They left because they fulfilled their vow. Is it vow, right?
Oath.
Oh, that's it.
I'm sorry?
I don't know. Jonathan?
That's fine.
I forgot.
Okay, let's take this.
Jacob.
Wait, so you said that Jacob, he broke his oath?
No, someone broke it over. I didn't hear
A
that.
lot of people broke oaths.
Yeah, Jacob broke it over.
Well, what's the point of oaths?
Huh?
Why are oaths important? Can you tell me?
Because it's important.
Yeah, that is true statement.
Because they involve God, I think, right?
Yeah, because usually when they do an oath, they usually say God's name involved.
Yeah.
It's kind of like when people get married, or when you go to the court and you testify in front of the court and you put your hand on a Bible. That's supposed to mean something. That's supposed to mean that you're telling the truth in front of God and you put that on the line. It's a big deal. But nowadays it's just a symbol and most people don't even care. But it was symbolic of something. It meant that your word is everything. And if you lie, whatever, it's going to fall upon you, whatever you did. And so so oaths were important, yes. That is a true statement. Anybody else can tell me what else did I talk about? Yes.
We learned about
Casuistic.
casuistic and apodictic.
Could you explain them?
Yes, casuistic laws are laws that are a case-by-case law. Basically, they're if and then laws. So, like, if you do this, then this will happen. And then apodictic laws are like direct commands, like thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal, whatever I think so.
And what was the purpose of apodictic laws?
The purpose of act was to set the behavior that God expects.
So it's telling you how to live, basically.
How to live life.
Now, the recap I was really looking for was just the half that I covered, the second half.
Oh,
But it's fine.
oh,
It's fine.
I know.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, you got it?
That's what I was gonna say.
Well, you can read it.
I think that's what Jesse was going to say,
Yeah.
too.
I
Jacob
didn't know
vowels.
he was gonna pick on me.
He had it here and he wanted to get it.
Yeah.
I got nervous.
The vowel.
I got nervous.
So, Jacob, out of fear, he submits to Esau. He's afraid that he's going to kill him. So he starts buttering him up, calling him master, giving him an offering, bowing down 7 times, making himself look like a loser, in front of him. And then he disobeyed God. He doesn't go to Bethel, and he buys land and settles near Shechem. And in the disobedience that he did, it brings chaos into his life. Because not only did that thing happen with Dinah, later on you see that his first son, Reuben, goes and sleeps with his concubine, which is he did it on purpose, as an affront. Like, I don't respect you as my father, I don't respect you as the head of the house. I'm going to do this in defiance, I'm going to bring shame. And that's why he loses the birthright. And it starts moving from Simeon to, who was the next one? I think it was
Levi.
Wait, talking about
Levi?
Reuben?
I think it was Simeon. I think it was Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and then Judah was the 4th one. But it starts moving down from the sons, but each one keeps messing up. Simeon and Levi, they disqualified themselves because they brought shame to Jacob in God's name. Reuben slept with a concubine, which is a no-no. What else?
That's a no-no.
Judah, he ends up sleeping with a prostitute.
Yeah.
That's a big thing.
That's mine next week.
That's yours next week.
Yeah. That'd be great.
all the sons end up messing up, but this chaos, if you look at it, it all links back to Jacob messing up. If he would have just followed God and just stuck to his word, he probably would have been in a better position. He wouldn't have gone to Shechem, and Dinah wouldn't have been raped. He would have gone to Bethel like he should have, and none of those problems would have happened in the first place. So that shows you that if you are following God, if you stick to it, everything's going to be fine for the most part. Some things might happen. You might encounter an Esau, you know. So you might encounter things that bring you fear, but if you stick to it, you know, you'll persevere those things. But if you let that fear overcome you and you submit to it, then bad things can happen. Oh, I forgot to mention one thing that was interesting. When you see that when he goes to meet Esau, he divides the camp in two, and then he sends Leah first, and then after that Rachel, because he was hoping, well, not hoping, but he was worried if he did try to attack his family, at least the second half would die, and his favorite half will survive. And that kind of shows you the character of Jacob too. Like, he wasn't this totally righteous person. He had his problems, and if you look at the Bible, a lot of the Bible characters, they have these problems, and that shows us that, you know, like, they're still men, but we have to learn from those things. And like I said, this chaos that Jacob creates is a chaos that goes throughout his family, and eventually that chaos escalates, and they end up selling Joseph into slavery. And then, thankfully, God restores everybody from that. So what do we learn from this? You know, we have to understand the importance of oaths. So when you give your word to God, when we go up front, when we do the feast and we do the prayers and stuff like that, you know, we're giving our word to God that we'll follow Him and keep His commandments. You know, not only that, but be example and be good people. So when you go out there into the world and you're not in church and nobody's watching you and you're not behaving like you're supposed to and you're being like a two-face, you know, you're bringing shame to God's name. But you gave your word not only to God but to your parents too, and that means something. You can't just say one thing and not really mean it. And nobody likes those type of people anyway. And on top of that, you have to be careful which oaths you give. You know, a good example today, a type of vow is a marriage. You know, it is a vow. It's a marriage vow, and you have to be careful who you marry. You can't just pick somebody. Some people, they make mistakes and they do things out of emotions, and they marry a person, and then they find out that they were not the right person. And now what are you gonna do? You can't just leave the person. You committed to that relationship. What are you gonna do?
And you use God's name.
Yeah, God's name is involved in that. So
you can't just
be like, well, I don't really like the way they cook and stuff like that, and gamoosh. So you can't just keep your oaths to anybody. You know? You have to be careful who you give your promises to. And going astray, not following God's word, it leads to chaos. And we're going to see that theme throughout the Bible. Every time somebody leaves God's protection, it brings all of this chaos. It brings all this problems. And you'd think it'd be easy for people to get that idea in their heads that they should stick in God's word. But, you know, it's not easy. You know, we all live our lives, and sometimes it's tough, sometimes it's hard. You know, I can say from experience that sometimes life can be really difficult, and it can be hard to stick to it. But if you persevere, you know, you'll get something out of it. And we have to learn that not to let the fear guide us. You know, Rico was saying something that was very interesting. He was saying that, you know, it's very natural for you to be afraid. It's fine to be afraid. But what happens is, what matters most is what you do afterwards. You know? If you're afraid and you let that manipulate your decision making, you can make a mistake. You know? But if you know what to do, for example, he was using jiu-jitsu. You know, jiu-jitsu, you train and you do all this training. So when you get in a certain scenario, you know what to do. It will be scary if somebody comes to you with a knife, but because you have that training, you know exactly what to do and you can handle it. But if you're not ready, you know, if you guys don't really read the Word or have this relationship with God, one day something bad is going to happen to you, because that's life. You know, it's not a guarantee. It's just how life is sometimes. Sometimes it's tough. You know? And Yeshua talks about that. Yeshua says that there's the house that's founded on sand and the house is founded on rock. And when the storm came, the house that was founded on sand, it was washed away. And the house that was founded on the rock, it stood still. And what it's talking about is the rock, you know, the Word. So when you found yourself in the Word, no matter what happens to you, even if it's the worst, you can make it. And we see it in the Bible, like the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those guys are a really good example because they went through hell. I mean, they were put in the furnace. And God saved them because they would not bend the knee, they would not give themselves over because they were faithful to God. And, we have to learn from those good examples, not just the negative ones of how we're supposed to do it. And we have to understand that if you keep your end, God is always going to keep his. That's a good thing. When this whole relationship that we have, this couple that we are the people that suck. We always break our word. But God, he loves us so much, You're here right now. The church, everything that's going on, it's because he looked after you guys. He went after you guys. He wanted you guys to be here. You know what I mean? He sought you guys after. So you have to take that into account. And you can't take that for granted, You're here because he wanted you to be here. So if you misuse that opportunity, you're throwing out a good chance to learn, to build this relationship with God that other people don't really have or want. Some people don't even want it. People, not just non-religious people, but people that are religious, you bring this to them and they're like, I really don't want that. I just want the simple stuff. I want to go to church, sing, hear a very simple teaching, and then go home and watch Sunday Night Football. So take this opportunity that you have and try to learn from it. Because this is something that a lot of people wish they would have. So this made me think about this verse in Matthew 6:25. It's actually one of my favorite verses. So I'll read it. So it says, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in the barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? Why do you worry about clothes? See how the flowers of the field grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." And I think that's something that Jacob should have done. He shouldn't have worried about what was going to happen tomorrow, or worry about Esau if he was going to kill him or not. Just worry about today and what he needed to do. And he failed in that part. His failure brought failure to his family, and it creates this whole cascading domino effect. And to be honest, that still happens today. Your mistakes can affect a whole other generation, or the good deeds that you do, you can sow it and it grows into the next generation. And you guys are young, and you have a lot ahead of you. And you have this opportunity that people don't have in their old age. When people are old, they have less and less chances to fix things. Once they make a mistake, it's really hard to fix it. But you guys have this opportunity to set out this path forward for you guys, where you can only do good for yourself, for your family, and one day down the line when you guys have your own families, you can set up a path for them. Because if you don't build a good foundation, then eventually the family after you and the family after that, it's just going to keep crumbling down until they're gone. You know what I mean? So you got to set up what you do today, so that way in the future, your generations can thank you for it. And a personal example is like my father and his grandfather. He was a pastor, and he was a good pastor. And his good works, my dad tells a story about that, and it has that personal effect on me. And even though I've never met him, like I mentioned before, but it has that impact on my life. So your actions can affect, like I said, another generation. And that's what I think you guys need to think about throughout this year. How your actions can affect you and the generation after you. And that is going to conclude the portion. So thank you everybody.